Hi, welcome back to my studio. Today is my full review of the Klipsch Cornwall 4s. And before I get into this, I want to say that if you had told me 35 years ago or so that I had a big pair of Klipsch speakers in my future, I would have thought that was very unlikely. I only heard Klipsch's a couple times in the early 80s. One was a pair of Heresies, their smallest speaker in the Heritage line. And they were, while they were very dynamic and they played loud, they did not have enough bass, and they were very harsh and bright. The opposite of what I considered a good audiophile speaker. And then a couple years later, I was able to briefly listen to a pair of Klipsch horns, which is their top-of-the-line heritage speaker. And while I appreciated the speaker's full and pleasing sound, it did not have the detail and resolution that I associated at the time with high-end audio. And basically that was the last time I seriously listened to Klipsch speakers until about 6 months ago. I drove up to New Hampshire and listened to a pair of Klipsch Forte 3s, which I had heard really good things about from Steve Guttenberg, who has a great YouTube channel, which I highly recommend. The Audiophiliac Daily Show, I think is what he calls his channel. Anyway, I listened to those and I was pretty impressed with them. They sounded good. They did have one quality which always which concerns me a little, is that in a number of different things I listened to on that system, they tended to homogenize the sound of different recordings. So whether the recording was, no matter the kind of music or anything, there was sort of an overall sameness to the sound I was hearing, which I consider to be some kind of coloration with the system, not necessarily all in the speakers. So some time went by, and then I had the chance to go up again, and I was really keen to hear the just newly introduced Cornwall 4s. I drove up to this dealer in New Hampshire and listened to the Cornwall 4s, and they sounded terrible. I mean, I was so looking forward to hearing these speakers after all the good things I read and heard about them. Again, Steve Guttenberg, the Audiophiliac, whose opinion I trust because in the past a number of things he said line up with the things, the years of experience I have seem to mesh very well, and that gives me a lot of trust in his opinion. So I listened to these things and they just sounded lifeless, dead, not dynamic, sloppy bass, muffled, everything you don't want to hear in a high-end speaker, and significantly worse sounding than the Forte 3s I had heard at the same dealer about a month before. So that was weird. That speaker was not for me, if that's how they sound. But the more I thought about it, I was there and I thought, well, I don't like the sound of these Cornwall 4s. Why don't I see what I think? They had a pair of La Scala 2s, which are now out of date. They now make the AL5 version, but the La Scala 2s are the predecessor to the La Scala AL5s. So I listened to those in a different listening room, And I have to say, I was really impressed. They had a low distortion that I don't maybe never have heard, and it's very hard to explain what that is. That was particularly in, I would say, the upper mid-range. Things like triangles and cymbals, and certain voices, just unbelievably effortless and easy to listen to, but high resolution. The downside of that speaker is it takes up more floor space, and the biggest downside is the bass. It does not go as deep as the Cornwalls on paper, and that is what I observed listening firsthand. It didn't go as deep, and there was kind of because of that, there was a bit of honkiness to the sound. So it's being a little harsh, but the bottom line is I felt in order to be happy with the La Scalas, I was going to need at least a pair of subwoofers to fill out the bottom. And you know, my concept was to look into buying a roughly a $10,000 system, and something that was pretty simple and reasonably compact. So I hemmed and hawed, but ultimately I did choose the Cornwalls. So let me get back to my story. I thought about this for several weeks, and I asked them, would it be okay? I told them I thought the Cornwalls sounded terrible, and I didn't understand it. Would it be okay if I bring my own amp and preamp up, and my own DAC, and try them with the Cornwalls? And they said, sure, bring them up, just call ahead of time, bring them up. And so I did that, and I listened to the Cornwalls a second time with my own DAC, preamp, and amp. And they were dramatically better. I was really enjoying it. I thought, okay, I think this is the direction I want to go in. Now, I still think the La Scalas had a superior mid-range and upper mid-range / treble. But as I said, I wanted a simple system. I didn't want to start with subwoofers and whatnot. So I chose to go with the Cornwalls, which I ordered in walnut. Now what I'm going to do is show you the speakers in detail and some things that I like and don't like about the Cornwall, the physical Cornwall. Then I'll talk about the sound of the speakers. This is the packaging that the Klipsch Cornwall 4s come in. This box is 43 inches high and 20 by 30 inches footprint. So it's a big box. My 2012 Subaru Outback could just barely fit a pair of these boxes. Each speaker comes in its own box. In the back. Now that's with the back seats folded down and both front seats pulled forward almost as far forward as they'll go. So unless you have a decent sized crossover or a full-size SUV or pickup truck, I would not plan on being able to move these in the cartons in one trip. Each speaker comes with this thick plastic protecting the top and bottom of the speaker, and then there's the usual very nicely done foam, durable foam end caps that go on the top and the bottom. So the speaker is really well protected in this shipping material, and I really recommend that you hold on to that shipping material in case you need to ship it somewhere for a repair, which isn't likely, but if you don't know how to take a driver out yourself and put in a new driver, or if you move or you sell them and you want, if you move, this is a great way to move them around without banging them up. And if you sell them, it's a big plus to have this original packing material. Not only is it a nice thing for a buyer to get, but in addition to that, you can ship them anywhere in the world, really, in these heavy-duty cartons and packing material. Yeah, they do take up a lot of room, but one thing you can do is either collapse the boxes and store them collapsed, or you can put other cartons, say from your preamp and amp and DAC, can go inside these, so it doesn't really take up as much extra room as it would if you stored them empty. So this is the Klipsch Cornwall 4, and I'm going to show you some things about it. So I hope you can see it a little better now. Let's see. Yeah, that's better. So first of all, in my opinion, this is a good looking speaker. It doesn't have, it's just a simple, high quality, rectangular cabinet, and it has, I have it on these moving dollies, which I talk about in my how to position the Klipsch Cornwall and other horn loudspeaker video I made. But you'll notice it has it sits on this incorporated plinth, and what that does is gives the speaker kind of a floating look. If you go to an art museum and you look at the pedestals that sculptures and things are on, you'll notice that they don't just have the sides here go all the way down to the floor. They'll have it raised on a little platform because it's aesthetically pleasing, and that is built into the Cornwall. Now, overall, I think it is very nicely made. The finish is really smooth, and they did a good job here with the veneers. The miters in the corner, they're all really tight. One thing about this I should mention is whatever finish Klipsch uses is not particularly durable. It scratches very easily. In fact, I think these two little scratches here were on the speaker when I took them out of the box for the first time. I don't know if that happened when they packed them or what. So starting with the front, there are these grills which are magnetic. So these come off. And yes, the speaker does sound a little different with the grills removed than on. They're a little more open and clear in the mid-range with the grills off. I think the bass might be a little better too, but I'd have to do a separate careful A/B on that. I usually listen with the grills on, but when I'm doing really critical listening, I will take them off. So here's a speaker with the grill removed. This is obviously the tweeter horn, the mid-range horn, the 15-inch bass driver, and the 3 ports for the bass. Pebble finish. There, this is some good video. And you can see the nice finish here on top. And you might be able to see these little scratches here that were in the finish when I got it. So as I rotate this around and get the light, I'll show you a couple things about the back. Here's the binding posts, and these are nice metal, and you can put a socket tool on that if you want to get them really tight. I'm a little reluctant to do that because I think it's going to, there's a good chance I'd over tighten something. All sides of the speaker are nicely finished, including the back, but it is this black paint. And I understand why they do that, because a lot of people will put them against the wall. They're called Cornwalls, which is short for corner or wall. But in some ways it would be nice if this were finished. I could imagine these in a living room where you might want to pull them, have them away from the wall, and this would be visible, and it would look nicer if this was finished. But that's then they'd have to charge more for the speaker, and most people wouldn't care. Another thing I wish is they've got this label on the back here. This has the serial number and whatnot, and I don't know, for what it would cost, it would have been nice if the small extra cost, milled out a pocket similar to the one for the binding post and had a metal plate there. This just looks a little, this is like a plastic decal. I just think it'd be nicer, but it is on the back. I actually think overall it's very nicely done, and all of these screws that hold the mid-range horn, the different horns and the woofer in, the nuts, they're threaded metal nuts pressed into the wood. So you can take these screws in and out over and over. You're not going to strip the holes. The grill here, this is something I want to discuss. So here's the back of the grill. I have not removed these shipping cushion washers yet. They just peel off. These are the magnets here. There's quite a few of them. These silver button magnets, which have quite a nice grip. What I want to mention about the grills, this is a really, in my opinion, a really handsome grill that they have. And you'll notice they're somewhat translucent where they don't have the wooden backing. You see that? Now, today is depending on the weather, these grill cloths can get a little, they can sag a little, and looks a little unsightly when they do, but it seems that they usually, when it's either dry or humid, I'm not sure which way, they tighten up again. So that's just something to keep in mind. Sometimes they're going to have a little waviness to them where they're not glued to the wood and back here. So keep that in mind. Actually, this is some kind of composite. It's not normal wood. And to put the grills back, it's very easy. You just get that bottom in and snap them in. The one thing I like, and this is a personal matter, I like the way the grills fit inside. They're not just superficially mounted to the box. They're set in, and if I remove those foam washers, they go in even further. I kind of like being able to grab the grill easily to remove it when I want to, so I left those on. It's a good looking speaker. When the light's at the right angle, you can sort of see through to the woofer and the two horns. So that gives you a little look at the Cornwall 4s. I am, overall, I'm pleased with the speakers. You might ask, well, why did I pick these? Well, in my case, I was thinking, well, probably want to spend somewhere in the $8,000 to $12,000 range on my whole system. And by going with a speaker like the Cornwalls, which are $6,000, that was a big part of my budget. But it would enable me to really potentially get by with a high quality but low power amp. So that would save a lot there. As I mentioned too, they're essentially full range speakers. I mean, technically full range might be down to 20 hertz, and these don't go down that low surely. But their adequate bass performance means I don't need to have subwoofers. though I do think they would be even better with a pair of good subwoofers. Another factor when considering loudspeakers is how they sound at low levels. Some speakers really need a lot of power and they need to be played loud or they just can't get out of their own way. Whereas these sound really nice, very low. They sound surprisingly good and balanced, and have a little, they're just very animated sounding, even when you play them quietly, which is a really nice thing. Another really important factor for any loudspeaker is, and this takes a little bit of experience to understand what I'm going to say, but the dispersion characteristics of the speaker. Most of my audiophile career, as it were, was done listening to large, full-range, extremely revealing electrostatic loudspeakers. And they were very resolving. They're still the best speakers I've ever heard in terms of dynamics and detail, but they had some big drawbacks. One of the big drawbacks was you needed to treat the back wall behind the speakers with sound-absorbing material, or they would have a very little bass and very uneven bass. And another huge drawback with those speakers, probably the biggest drawback, was they really only sounded good if you're sitting in the sweet spot. And I mean, if you moved your head this much, the whole image would shift right or left. And I put up with that for a long time, and I decided from now on I'm never going to get another speaker like that. So these Cornwalls are somewhat sensitive to seating position, as most speakers are. But if you set them up the way I explain in the video about setting them up, where the two speakers, the center axes of the speaker, cross in front of the listening sofa or seat, there's a reasonably wide sweet spot, enough that 2 or 3 people can sit side by side and enjoy listening. And I like that when I'm listening with friends or family. I want to share my system with them and have them enjoy it too. So that's really important. And these are somewhat directional in that regard, certainly, but they're not extremely directional. The other thing is, when you stand up versus sitting down, when I have these speakers on the dollies, it brings the woofer and tweeter pretty close to my ear level in this chair or many other chairs. But when you stand up, you lose some of the high frequencies for sure. So I still find it pleasant to listen to when I'm working here in my studio and the music's playing, even if I'm standing, but it certainly changes the sound. Now, something like a tall Magnapan would not have that effect to the same degree. And neither would 2 small bookshelf point source kind of speakers like the Bucard S400s that I've listened to for many, many hours in this same room. Those were wonderful in that you could move all over the room and still enjoy the sound almost as much as when you're sitting in the best spots. These are not like that, but there's definitely roll-off as you move around the room and stand up. Another aspect of these speakers that I like is, while they sound better pulled away from the wall, you can put them near the wall. That's what they're designed for technically, and still get pretty good sound out of them. So in that regard, they don't take over a whole room if you don't want them to. If you want the best sound, it is still best to pull them out, but you don't need to do that to get reasonably good, enjoyable sound. So in summaries, they're not these high-tech looking bizarre things. You can play them with a very small, low-powered amp. by the way, the fact that they're efficient means they don't need much power to play loudly. That's not really the same as saying they're easy to drive. Those efficient and easy to drive are two totally different things. Sometimes they overlap, but that's not necessarily the case. So you can play them loud with a small amplifier. They're simple boxes. They don't need subwoofers. They don't need stands. They have bass. They play loud. One thing I want to mention, and this may be controversial, these are big speakers with a big 15-inch woofer and big mid-range horn and all that. And they're very efficient, so they play loud with not much power. Everyone will be able to blast these with almost any amp you have. But they sound best to my ears when they're at low levels or medium levels. When you play them loud, in my opinion, things fall apart. I think they clip in a way. I don't think it's my amp clipping. I think that the crossover is clipping. I think I'm hearing problems with the inductors, which have iron cores saturating. So I think that's a shortcoming of the speaker, and I want to go on record saying that I believe that is one of the weaknesses. They sound great up to a level, and then beyond that they sound strained. They don't have that extra kick. They run out of kick, and it's not what I was expecting before I heard them firsthand. But I knew they were going to be that way when I got them. Most of the time I don't listen that loud, so it's not really a problem for me. But I'd be aware of that, and I may even fiddle around with some crossover modifications and report on those when I do them, but I want you to be aware of that. They still sound pretty good. I'd say the thing I like best about these speakers is when played at reasonable levels, they have a very majestic kind of sound, a rich, full, pleasant sound. They're very revealing. So you don't have to worry that you're not going to reach a resolution limit with these speakers. If you make changes upstream, if you change your wires, if you change your DAC, your preamp, or your amp, you're going to hear the difference with these speakers. And I think the best thing about the sound of them is what I think is really linearity of the speaker. No speaker's perfectly linear, but I think a lot of speakers are very compressed. So as you play a louder signal, they don't get as loud as they should compared to the signal going into the speaker. And I think that is what gives the Klipsches their exciting dynamic sound, is actually linearity. And that goes back to what I also think is they're very low distortion. You can play these at reasonable levels and you'll barely see the woofers moving. Even if you touch the woofer to see how much it's moving, it's barely moving, and they can be playing pretty darn loud. And the same thing with the horn, woofer, mid-range, and tweeter. The diaphragm that can be moving very little, but because it's coupled to the air with the horn, it's a very efficient transfer that keeps the diaphragm moving in a very linear range. And it's a really appealing sound quality. The other thing about horns, the mid-range and tweeter, they are somewhat directional, and that can be a very good thing to be able to tailor the tonal balance by rotating the speaker for more or less toe-in, but it can also really help by minimizing interactions with the room. If you have a speaker an omnidirectional speaker, let's say, or a point source speaker, you're going to get a lot more direct reflections off the wall because of that omnidirectional characteristic, whereas these makes it a little more forgiving in that regard. Part of the reason some bookshelf, really all bookshelf speakers sound small to me, is even if they image well, all the instruments in that image are small. And in the real music, a piano is big, a standing bass is big, a drum kit is big. So if you get used to listening to bookshelf speakers, that's all you've heard. While they can image really precisely, and in some ways it's easier to make a bookshelf speaker, a little two-way bookshelf speaker, image really well in terms of precisely, it's like a dollhouse. I mean, everything's this tiny little band playing. Even if the image overall is pretty wide because you have the speakers set reasonably wide apart, there's just no bigness to the individual instruments, and I don't think that's as nice to listen to. It's not as fun, and I just do this for fun. I mean, that's really what it's about. These Cornwalls also have that big sound, and it's something that's a little hard to explain unless you've experienced it firsthand. But before choosing these, I listened to some very high quality bookshelf loudspeakers, but they just sounded small. So there's something to be said for the scale. I mean, when you go and hear a jazz band or a rock concert or something, there's a bigness to the sound, and I didn't want to give that up. That was a must-have. So that's one of the reasons I went with the Cornwalls. And it's one of the things I think the Cornwalls are better at than the Fortes or the Heresies. So if you're considering those speakers, you might want to consider these if that's important to you. You know, the footprint, they cost more, obviously. The Heresies are $3,000 a pair, the Fortes are $4,000 a pair, these are $6,000 a pair. But in that they're all in the 3 to 6 range, and they all take up roughly the same amount of floor space. I mean, technically, of course, these take up more, but it's not a huge difference. So if you can swing the money and you don't mind the size of them, you might want to consider these Cornwalls. All right. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this review and you got something out of it. As I mentioned before, I read all the comments on my videos, and I appreciate everyone watching them. I can't necessarily respond to all the comments, though I try to respond to some of them. Yeah. In summary, I'm really enjoying the Cornwalls, and I think it was a good choice for me. I'll have more about these speakers even in some future reviews. So thank you very much for watching. Have a great day. Thanks.